I want to welcome everybody back. Children with incarcerated parents often experience profound grief and ambiguous loss. In our next session, Gregory Gomez, Monique Joseph, and Dr. Julie Kaplow will highlight the developmental, familial, and systematic impact of this experience, blending clinical expertise and lived experience to illustrate ways the justice system can better respond. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. We are so thrilled to be here to talk with you today about what we think is a very much overlooked topic, but something that's very important. And so once again, my name is Julie Kaplow. I'm the Executive Vice President of Trauma and Grief Programs and Policy at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. And I also direct our, our Trauma and Grief Center, which is housed at the Hackett Center for Mental Health here in Houston. And I'm thrilled to be up here with my two colleagues today. So I thought what we could do is start by just kind of telling you what we're going to do. So today we're going to start with a theoretical overview of childhood grief and ambiguous loss. We're going to share the scope of what we know about parental incarceration and disenfranchised grief, talk about current data and intervention, healing and restorative justice, and then collective and individual actions. And I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about what we do at the Trauma and Grief Center. So at the Trauma and Grief Center, we have 4 different pillars. And the first is that we focus on developing evidence-based interventions for kids who've experienced any form of trauma or the death of a loved one. We do training in the community, training community and school-based clinicians, as well as any individual who is working with children who've experienced trauma or loss. And then we do research looking at the long-term impact of trauma and bereavement on children, as well as the effectiveness of the interventions that we're using. And finally, we make policy recommendations based on what we know are best practices for kids who've experienced trauma or grief. We also have an affiliated group practice called the Lucene Center, where we provide teletherapy to children and adolescents who've experienced any form of trauma or the death of a loved one or loss of a loved one across the state of Texas. And the reason I mention this is because the Trauma and Grief Center and Lucene Center really work hand in hand to ensure that the practices we're using at Lucene are evidence-based, but also our clinicians provide critical feedback to our researchers at the TAG Center to let them know what's working and what's not working. And so I wanted to start by talking about what is childhood grief and what is bereavement. So bereavement is the experience of deprivation or loss by death, whereas grief is the psychological or behavioral response that arises from bereavement. And grief is a universal experience, but grief reactions are very unique to different children and adolescents. And children's grief reactions, not simply bereavement, play an important role in future psychological functioning. So whether we're talking about an actual death or an ambiguous loss, it's actually the child's grief that is most predictive of how they're going to do over the longer term. We also know that ambiguous loss differs from ordinary loss. So ambiguous loss is when there is no verification of the death, so the person is missing, no certainty that the person will come back, and no guarantee that things will return to the way they used to be. So some very important examples of ambiguous loss include parental incarceration, deportation, deployment, or even kidnapping. And we know that children can experience grief reactions, very strong grief reactions that Gregory will talk about in a few minutes, in response to ambiguous loss. So what do we know about grief in general? Well, we've spent many, many years really studying and understanding how children grieve. And what we find is that grief is multidimensional. And what does that mean? It means that it's not as if children have or don't have prolonged grief disorder, or they have or don't have maladaptive grief. What we know is that grief can be experienced in these 3 different domains. So kids can be high or low on separation distress, that's yearning or longing for the person who died. They can be high or low on existential distress, that is, how am I going to live my life without this person? And they can be high or low on circumstance-related distress. That's being very preoccupied with the way they died, or in the case of ambiguous loss, with the way they left. We also know that there's an adaptive counterpart to each of these dimensions. So for example, with separation distress, we know that kids can find healthy ways of connecting to the person who died. One example of this was I was working with a young girl whose mother died, and the more she engaged in behaviors that she used to do with her mom, like making her mom's favorite apple pie, going swimming because that was something they loved to do together, the more she felt connected to mom in a very different way, but in a healthy way. That would be the adaptive side of separation distress. With existential distress, we find that kids might say things like, I don't know how I'm going to get through life without my dad here. But we also hear them saying things like, I want to live the kind of life my dad would have wanted me to live, or I want to do things that would have made my dad proud of me. That is the adaptive side of that dimension. And with circumstance-related distress, we hear kids saying things all the time about how they want to transform the circumstances of the death into something that can help other people not have to suffer in the same way. So for example, I was working with a young boy whose father died in a tragic plane crash. And I asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be an engineer so I can make planes that don't break anymore. And we hear this kind of thing all the time. I want to be an ER doctor so I can save lives the way I wish they had saved my brother. I want to raise money for breast cancer because of the fact that my mom died of breast cancer. And so when we're talking about how to support kids through their grief, what we're really talking about is not just trying to reduce those more upsetting grief reactions that keep them stuck, but harnessing and growing those adaptive grief reactions that can help them to thrive. I'm going to give you a few examples of this, and you'll see in just a few minutes why this is so important. But when we talk about separation distress, this is one example of a boy who lost his father, and his mom is asking him to go to the game together, and he's saying, I don't want to ever go back there anymore. It's just too painful without him. We hear this kind of thing all the time from kids, where they will stop doing the things they used to love doing because doing those things without the person there is just too painful for them. Similarly, this is a girl whose father died, and she just got accepted to the college of her choice, and she's thinking that she doesn't want to pursue this anymore if he's not going to be a part of it anyway. What is the point? And we hear this kind of thing all the time from kids where they may stop pursuing their hopes or dreams or aspirations for the future when the person who was most supportive of them is no longer there. And then finally, this is a classic example of circumstance-related distress. This is a girl whose brother died in a gang fight. And she thinks about, every time she thinks about him, she is filled with those anger-inducing thoughts and feelings about how he died, and she just can't get past that and hold on to positive memories. And we see this all the time with circumstances that are painful, where kids may want to positively reminisce about their person, but every time they think about them, they're flooded with those very upsetting thoughts and images and cannot hold on to the positive memories. And so what we know is that these things do happen in the context of ambiguous loss, and certainly in the context of parental incarceration. So with separation distress, we still see that in kids where there's been an ambiguous loss, the preoccupation with their absence, yearning and longing, so they have loneliness, fantasies of reunification, they may be angry, there's that uncertainty of when are they coming back. And so we'll hear kids saying things like, when is dad coming back? When can I see him again? Similarly, we see that existential distress, struggling with their identity, feeling lost without the person there, feeling different from other kids. I'm the only kid whose parent is in prison. Pessimistic outlook on life, or an identity crisis. Who am I now without them here? So no one understands what this is like. I feel like I don't really know who I am anymore. And then finally, circumstance-related distress. Kids can become very preoccupied with how they left. So unable to move forward due to the uncertainty of the circumstances. Are they going to be coming back? Are they not? How long is that going to take? Anger, distress, wanting to get revenge, and thinking to themselves, I can't stop thinking that he's going to just walk through that door. So they're sort of left in this limbo state of not knowing what is going to happen. And we also know that there are some important long-term consequences of untreated maladaptive grief, whether it's in the context of bereavement or another type of loss. We see relationship problems, substance abuse, poor school grades, school dropout, depression, suicidal thoughts or behaviors, and sometimes even police involvement or criminal behavior. And so that's why if we can identify these kids early and get them the support they need early on, we can actually help to prevent their long-term suffering. And so what we want to be able to do is address these key bereavement-related challenges. So the first is, how do I find a way to feel connected to the person, even though he or she is now physically absent? Secondly, who am I as a person? What is the meaning and purpose of my existence now that they're physically absent? And then how do I think about, feel about, and come to terms with how this person left? So even though we know that untreated maladaptive grief can lead to all of those problem outcomes that I just mentioned, the good news is that we do have some really helpful evidence-based interventions that can help kids to grapple with having that person not be there and to really harness those more adaptive grief reactions that we just talked about. So feeling connected, making meaning of that loss, and then hopefully finding their own identity again. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Gregory, who's going to tell us more about disenfranchised grief.
Thanks, Julie, for setting that stage. And before I go to the next slide, I'm just genuinely curious, and I have a Posca marker here. I'm genuinely curious, who in here, if we had to sketch something out, and I asked for a talented or creative artist, can someone raise their hand if they'd be willing to, I know it's a large group, but sketch something out with this marker if you're a super talented and creative artist? So just raise, looks like we got one back there, okay. That's amazing. Now, just 1 second before you come all the way up here, because I think you're helping prove a really important point. And there's actually, wait just 1 second, there's actually a second part to this. Now I want you to imagine if we all rewind into a kindergarten classroom, and you have a teacher standing at the front of the kindergarten classroom with a small table, those little tables that the little kids can see over as they're sitting on a carpet in front of them. And the teacher's about to begin the next activity. And that teacher lays out in front of the students who are looking on some construction paper. And then she lays out some glue. And then some glitter. And then some tape. And then some scissors and markers, and then she leans forward and she says, who in here is an artist? Now, raise your hand if you think the overwhelming majority of that kindergarten classroom is going to raise their hand. And can we give a round of applause for our brave participant back there? I give that example because something happened between that kindergarten classroom to now to where I would not raise my hand if that question was asked of me within the education system. But it isn't just limited to the education system, it's also within the justice system, within the mental health systems that we work within, that we somehow listen to the limits placed on ourselves. And with super complex social problems like ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief, it's necessary to do some undoing. That is, to pause, as we did during that amazing first session, and think about the things that we bring and the limits we set before considering such a complex social problem. And so some of the part of this section is some undoing. And the great thing about this room is that the very creation 8 years ago of this Judicial Commission on Mental Health shows that this is a group of people that are into undoing, where justice and mental health shouldn't be silos, but that they should be together. And so I feel comfortable sharing that example to start off with and some of the undoing, because that this is a type of challenge that we need to consider creativity and imagination for, considering its scope. And so that scope, to further set the stage, at the national level in the United States, the parental incarceration challenge includes 2.7 million children who currently have a parent in jail or prison, and 5.2 million children who have had an incarcerated parent at some point in the United States. Conservatively, that's 7% or nearly 500,000 of Texas children. And importantly, a racial dynamic, 12% of Texas residents are Black, but they constitute 33% of Texas prisons and 28% of Texas jails, which is important to this story because that means that about 1 in 9 Black children has a parent in jail or prison. Those are by the numbers, but important to the story is also by the social structures. Julie talked about ambiguous loss, but I also want to mention disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is a type of grief that differs from ordinary grief and ordinary loss in that the loss cannot be openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. It's a loss where the larger social structures really deny the right to grieve by the larger society. So you have these compounding and complex impacts for kids with incarcerated or jailed parents. You have, like Julie talked about, the ambiguous loss, that physical absence with psychological presence, where no formal mourning ritual, which often provides closure, can be had. And then, for a variety of reasons, you have the compounding disenfranchised grief, where maybe a well-intentioned and even warranted grandmother might say, don't talk about the fact that your dad is locked up at school because the teacher is going to label you as well. But we also have the mores that we have as a society towards crime and criminals. So we collectively decide who's worthy of mourning. And we differentiate, our systems do, between different levels of crime. So a person who is committed of a crime like capital murder or sexual assault will be viewed differently than a person who's committed petty theft. And so those differences further unsee the actual grief reactions that a child may have. We have the racial disproportionality that I talked about, where because of denied racial power and economic well-being, we also deny grief and bereavement research, resources, and therapies to those same kids. And then finally, we have the challenge of our own adult discomfort with grief. One of the hardest moments in all of our lives will be losing the person, people that we love, people that are close to us. And because of that, we have a difficulty talking about grief. But what's universal about that whole bottom bullet there of the complex and compounding impacts is that children are not seen in any of them. Children aren't getting a say in any of those at the bottom. And so how can we start undoing some of that and start seeing children a bit more with this unique type of loss and grief? One important step is honoring individual grief reactions of children as real and valid whenever they have an incarcerated parent. This is an important step. If we left doing this, we would be doing 100% more than we often are in cases with parental incarceration. That grief reactions when a parent is incarcerated are real and valid. The second involves some exercise, which is why you have a brain working out at the bottom, where we self-interrogate our own bias and stigma towards impacted children. I have bias and stigma towards impacted children with parental incarceration, and so do many others within all of these systems. In 2000, there was a United States Senate report that talked about how 7 out of 10 kids who have a parent who's incarcerated will also become justice involved themselves. 7 out of 10. The problem was that those words appeared in a transcript, but there was no documentation of research behind it, and it wasn't substantiated, but just repeated because it was in a Senate report and often cited in many other publications. But there's no research that shows that that number is even close. In fact, there are folks that even have published additional papers to say, with the title, 7 out of 10, not even close, showing that with that particular paper, 6 different countries and studies show that it's nowhere near 70%, as quoted in that 2000 US Senate report, and closer to 30%, which is still real, but not 7 out of 10, and not predetermined for justice involvement. And in fact, at the TAG and Lucene Center, we see and have data from our TAG collaborative that shows something very similar, that the most common reaction of a child is not going to be to become justice involved and get upset into physical fights, as you see towards the bottom of this graph, but the more common reaction is that their kids are going to feel, when reminded, upset, afraid, or sad, or avoidant with the second one, trying not to think about it, or have sleep problems or psychological reactions, physiological reactions. Not so much getting upset or into physical fights, which is in the bottom third. And I want to go back to what Julie was sharing around these 3 dimensions of separation distress, existential identity distress, and circumstance-related distress. Because this is really so important to the seeing of this type of grief and ambiguous loss. And one of the beauties of multidimensional grief theory is that it allows for us to get one step closer to the grief reactions and naming and seeing them. And it also allows a continuum. Like Julie mentioned, these aren't just maladaptive reactions that children are having. Yes, a kiddo might be crying at night for an hour before they're going to sleep on the maladaptive side of separation distress, but they also might be baking a favorite meal or picking up a favorite hobby of the person that they're missing. Each one of these has a maladaptive and adaptive side, a helpful and unhelpful side to these types of grief reactions. And that's so important because with so many layers of unseenness, these allow us to see the children that we're working with a lot better. Here's another important finding from the work. This is also from our TAG collaborative. So the Trauma and Grief Center has trained clinicians and community members, both nationally and more recently internationally, with the 2 interventions in particular. But the interventions that we use, trauma and grief component therapy for adolescents and multidimensional grief therapy, aren't for everyone because kids just have different needs, whether it was a trauma or grief-related incident or whatever brings them to a clinic or community center. So importantly, before those needs are met, we want to make sure that interventions are actually working and helpful for the kids. And so we give assessments at the beginning, including from the previous data, the PTSD-RI out of UCLA, and here, the prolonged grief disorder. And what this slide is showing is that of these kids, which is a large sample of about 2,500 kiddos, you have on the gray line here those that have experienced traditional bereavement. So they lost someone important to them that they loved. And then you have in the blue line those within that sample whose bereavement is an ambiguous loss due to parental incarceration. And so you can see the difference in means here. For circumstance-related distress, it's 2.3, separation, it's 2.2, and existential identity, it's 2.1, all over that cutoff score of 2.0. That's an important cutoff score for our center at the Lucene Center because it generally speaks to the fact that this youth would qualify for services and need intervention. And so each one of those blue lines there is showing that the mean, the average for a kid that's presenting with an ambiguous loss due to parental incarceration is needing intervention that could help them identify those 3 grief domains. So there are different types of therapies that we can use to see this type of grief, and especially in this case, if trauma is associated with it, address trauma that is associated with it. So trauma and grief component therapy for adolescents is one of those types of interventions that I said the TAG Center trains on. So this includes 4 modules, can be done in group or individual settings. And you can see in Module 3 there allows for grief processing, as well as trauma processing in Module 2. It's designed to be administered 1 session per week over 45 to 60 minutes per session, and can be flexibly tailored to meet the needs of the children. So these are often, sometimes I was a former teacher and principal, sometimes you don't have 45 to 60 minutes, you have 27 before a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at lunch, and you have to get it done, and there's a lot of flexibility within this particular intervention. And then bringing in the multidimensional grief therapy and those 3 dimensions that we've talked about. Multidimensional grief therapy hones in even further and is an assessment-driven intervention based on multidimensional grief theory and those 3 dimensions. It's designed to promote adaptive grief reactions and reduce unhelpful grief reactions. It is the first evidence-based grief-focused intervention for children and adolescents that directly addresses those 3 primary domains. And it provides that continuum, not just adaptive, but also maladaptive types of grief reactions, which allow the continuum of grief to be seen within the youth that we're serving. And this can also be used individually or in groups and adapted for ambiguous losses. Within this type of intervention, where we can be addressing ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief, we have illustrations like these that show that continuum, that separation distress can look like majorly missing the Mendy, which would be more resemblant of like the crying or difficulty separating, and then creating connections, Claire. What way can I still acknowledge that I've lost the person, and in helpful and adaptive ways, find things and hobbies and ways to connect. Another example here within multidimensional grief therapy is the sticks and stones exercise that we use. And with the sticks and stones exercise, in a traditional approach, it allows youth to both talk about some of the ambivalent feelings that a child may have towards the person that's lost or incarcerated. And in this way, they're allowed to, on the stones, write things that they didn't enjoy. Maybe that for someone who's incarcerated, it's a crime that involves something that hurt others. And so they would write down on the stones something related to that. But it's conflicting with, and they're allowed to acknowledge on the sticks things that they do remember and love about the person. And then an adaptation that we can make to acknowledge some of the disenfranchised grief is very similar with the sticks and stones, where on the stones, we can acknowledge how society might view the person. Maybe the teachers or a church might view the person who's committed a crime and has been sent away to jail or prison. And those would be on the stones. And you could ask a youth, can you write down how you think they view your mom or dad? And then on the sticks, you could ask the same question of how you view your mother or father. And it's that distance between how society views the person who's in jail and incarcerated and how the child views how the person, their mother or father that's incarcerated, the distance in between those two is literally therapeutic. Seeing that and naming that can be therapeutic for a child. So those are 2 types of interventions that we use at the Lucene Center. And at the very end, we're going to wrap up with some action steps and concluding thoughts. But for now, I do want to say when to seek support for those types of interventions. One example is when behavior's daily life is impacted at school, at home, or with peers, when some feature of stuckness is seen and kids are having trouble daily functioning in any of those capacities. With extreme signs of depression, so really tearful, not able to get out of bed in the morning, or having PTSD reactions. For younger children, that can be significant development regressions, like problems with eating, sleeping, language, or bedwetting. And for adolescents, that might look like more extreme risk-taking behaviors. And then, of course, any gesture related to self-harm or the mentioning of suicide or homicidal ideation. That would be an example to reach out for some of those interventions within the systems that you work with. One thing that I forgot to mention that I do want to name, because this is such a diverse community here, is that multidimensional grief therapy has 2 different phases. And the first phase of it is designed to be administered by either a clinician or community members. That can be folks at bereavement centers, community pastors, teachers. And the first phase says, this is a collective action and needs a collective movement. So the first phase of MGT can be administered by those folks. And phase 2 within that intervention is administered by trained clinicians who could more directly deal with these higher level of needs. So it's a unique part of MGT. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Monique, who's going to talk about healing and restorative justice before we wrap up with concluding thoughts and actions on this.
Shortest person in the room. So I'll just let you know now, I'm not a doctor. I am a directly impacted person. I work at the University of Houston in community engagement, and I'm also a community organizer. A misconception oftentimes is that folks who go through the system, don't want to talk about their story. But I'm here to tell you that it is very liberating and healing for stories to be told and heard. And so thank you for giving me this space. November 16, 2016 was the last time that my 3 children saw their father. He would wake up every morning and take them to school, and that was the last day they saw him. On that day, he was arrested, and about a year and a half later, he was sentenced to 45 years. This is our last family photo. Before he was arrested, we were in Sugar Land Town Center. So when he first got arrested, we didn't know what to tell the kids. We thought, we'll just fight the case and he'll be home. So we'll just say he's at work. And so that was what we told them, because they were 8, 5, and 3, so pretty young. Each child had a different reaction. Once they found out that it wasn't work and he was sentenced to 45 years, we had to figure out how to tell them that. But the word work, mommy's going to work, was really triggering, because we tried our best to kind of hide them from that grief. I'll just want to talk to you a little bit about how it has affected my kids. This is really hard for me, y'all, because it's very personal. But my 8-year-old, my oldest son, he was 8, he's 17 now. I don't know if anybody in the room can identify with this, but maybe the parents can, but you see this light in your child, like the glow and the happiness and the excitement for life, it's gone. He is not the same boy anymore. And so we just try and find support and community to help lift him. My daughter, Peyton, she's a strong one. She doesn't cry. She tells everybody he's gonna be home, it's okay. But she does have really high anxiety around separation. So like when I go on work trips, it's hard every night. And then she does not spend the night with anybody. She won't go to her cousins, nobody's house. I have to force her, and it feels really bad. But we're working through that separation. And then my youngest child, he was 3 when his father left, so he has limited memory, but they're still in communication. And for him, it's just extreme lows and extreme highs. And it switches pretty quickly. And when he gets low, it's really low. There are times when we're at home and he cries for his father. And I wish that folks could see, they could see what we're dealing with. What builds resilience? It's spiritual support, peer support, all the things you see around that picture. People say, oh, when this happens, go to your community, go to your church, go to school, go to these places, and you'll get support. Oftentimes for family support and community support, it is, the first question is, what did they do? And it takes away from the grieving process, because then you're trying to validate their humanity based on the accusation, and it just gets, again, it's just really hard to grieve and connect with people in community and family because of the labeling. One example is recently I tried to schedule a visit for my children to go see their dad in TDC. And TDC has a new option on their website when you schedule a visit that you have to select, if you're not married to the person, you have to select illegitimate child's father or illegitimate child's mother in order to have a visit done. These small things make it really hard for children and families to find support in the community when we are viewed as illegitimate. Oftentimes in church, the same lack of compassion comes in. In school, there's often a scared straight tactic where folks think that your children need this rough, tough, do you want to end up like your dad thing? And like Gregory said, my children aren't violent at all. They just isolate and get really sad. One example is I work in restorative justice, and there was an event that went on, and we partnered with a group who tried their best to provide services for children who are incarcerated. And I never bring my kids to these events because people don't know. They do not know how to talk to children who have incarcerated parents. I don't, half the time know how to console them. And at this event, I remember one of the leaders telling the kids from 8 to 17, do you want to end up like your dad, your mom? They're in there getting raped. They're in there getting beat. And it was a room full of adults like this. Nobody made that noise y'all just made. That's not what happens out, in society. It is really this idea that if we instill enough fear, they won't go that direction. But what about their grief? One teacher made a big difference in our life, and her name was Miss Johnson. She had a lived experience similar to my children, and she knew the children's father before he was arrested. So she was able to see the changes in the children. And it just took that one person to really encourage and teach my children that everybody won't get it. Everybody won't give you validation for loving and supporting your father, but it's still important, and things can change. The last two things is justice to you may include, jail time and some type of punishment. But I would just ask that everyone in this room please consider how your decisions impact children and how harm is perpetuated. It takes some real bold leadership and that one person to stand up and offer up other options. Uh-oh. Click, click, click. This is a quote that I love, and it's at the bottom of my email. It says, "Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are indistinguishable." And I say that because after my ex got arrested, I started working in restorative justice, and I worked with a lot of people who had severe mental health and who had a lot of issues in the criminal justice system, and I found that they're not being listened to, they're not being heard, and once I heard them out, they became my best friends. You know, I got all the truth, I got everything I needed because I loved them and I listened, and so I encourage you to do the same.
Okay, very, very powerful. The Meadows Institute is one of the gifts that Texas gives not only to Texas, but to the rest of the United States. Got a little time, so does anyone have any questions for the panel? You're kidding me. There we go, okay. I'm not sure we have any mics, but yell it at me and I'll translate. Oh yeah, we do have mics.
Hi. That was wonderful. So we are actually, I'm Connie Almeida. We are actually really fortunate in Fort Bend County. We actually have a second chance grant that focuses on children of incarcerated parents. So thank you so much for sharing your story. So one of the things that we're also trying to do is support the community caregiver, the person that's left behind taking care of the children while the parent is incarcerated. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the challenges or resources that we have or need to have for those caregivers?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I think one of the points that, you know, Gregory kind of made was that there's not very much support. I mean, when I learned of Ambiguous loss, I didn't know I didn't have words for what I was experiencing with my family. And I'm working on my master's. I do criminal justice reform. I struggled with finding support. And so, yeah, recently at work, students were trying to do a project on, because of the story of my children, they wanted to do research on children with incarcerated parents. And it was extremely hard for them to find any data on who those children are. And so I'd say first need to acknowledge them, like we need to count them, we need to know who they are and where they are, and then we can start figuring out what the individual needs are. But yeah, it's, I mean, I feel like I have no choice as a single parent now. Yeah, we did all we could to make sure my children would be raised in a two-parent household, and the state decided something different. And so I have no choice.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyone else? Go to the mic.
Hi, my name is Dora. I just had a question about restorative justice and what that looks like here in Texas.
It doesn't look like Texas, as y'all know. So actually, I just talked about this yesterday. There was a judge that approached me a couple years ago. I do healing circles, and I started doing those because I connected with other folks in the community who had similar backgrounds, and actually that's the community where I found I'm not crazy, like this is a real issue and I need support. So in those groups, we created healing circles and we just go around and share. And there was a judge interested in doing that. It takes folks willing to do it, you know, like there are community groups. One is Restorative Justice Houston, There's groups out here that want to support, and it just takes some bold leadership to get it done.
Yeah, is this mic on also? Yeah, just add there, like Monique mentioned, there's a small group that just started, Restorative Houston, led by Anita Wadwa, who is an excellent restorative justice facilitator and leads healing circles herself. They just started here in Houston, Restorative Houston, and also it looks like this room too. With the personal undoing and work that we have, really not buying into the fact that this is a systemic problem, but this is both individual and systemic. So one individual action, one leading of a healing circle, and listening to stories can move us closer to that justice.
Judge.
I'm a state district felony judge, and I want to state for the record, it's not fun. We don't enjoy sending people to the pen, okay? But there are a lot of very, very vicious, bad, ugly people that are nothing but a threat. You don't have a choice. Here's what I want to know, and I came here to learn some things. Sorry that I'm ignorant about this, but if it exists, I'm sure I couldn't order it anyway. Has the state provided for the families of perpetrators? Judges have no choice. When we make that decision, we send them out. But does the state have any legislation in place that addresses the needs now, huge needs, as y'all have pointed out, of the people left behind in their families? I know we look toward the victims, and I always look out for victims' rights and needs, but what about the family, the little kids that are left behind? And if we don't have that, can this organization and all the people here, can we start lobbying and doing some things to get some kind of legislation? We seem to have money for all kinds of stuff that doesn't matter, but we never put money into the things that do matter. These are my questions. I'll sit down.
Okay. Anybody want to address that?
Yeah, amen. I definitely...
Amen.
Amen. Yes, and I would acknowledge that, I heard you at the beginning say, like, I'm sorry, I'm ignorant to this topic. I actually was, before my wife came, she was like, just go and share what your research is, because people aren't talking about ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief at cocktail parties. This is new, and needs to be known, and this is why we're here. And in terms of expanding the access, yeah, I think that's the call. To think about how do you widen what the scope of justice looks like. So it is a monumental task to think about further burdening this system, which has backlogged courtrooms, overworked public defenders, mental health clinicians that are strapped. But the very reason that it's so strapped is the very reason we need to stop the churn of it, to give relief to all the amazing people that are doing this work, which I know there are other compassion and burnout compassion fatigue and burnout sessions later, but that's why this work is necessary, because the churn and stopping that is so essential.
And I'll just add too, thank you for acknowledging, right, that you are harmed too, right? You are harmed too. So the harm is spread. It's not just the children. The harm is spread everywhere. So thank you for acknowledging that.
I have a question for Monique. Thank you for sharing your story. My name is Dr. Smith. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm more interested in the mental health of your children. A few months ago, I saw a documentary that was like a daughter-daddy dance, and it was very, very powerful to see that. Just the whole build-up to that date and the impact that it had on those children. So with your children, in your situation, do they get to have visitation? Do you think visitation is something that's helpful for children and their mental health? Or do you think that not visiting is more protective, because people feel different ways about that?
Yeah, I can just speak for in my particular case. My ex-husband was a fabulous father. He was a cook. He could fix anything. He'd take the kids to the park. He had all this energy. So the relationship that they have is really, really strong. Before COVID, they would have in-person visits, and we were able to sit with him and touch him and things, and then COVID happened, and now the visits, I don't think they've ever gone back to normal. It depends on the location, but they have a strong desire for their father. My youngest, if he doesn't hear from my boys, when they don't hear from their dad in a couple days, they're asking, where, is he okay, do I know? And so, yeah, they yearn for their father, and, you know, the reason I scheduled this illegitimate visit was because they were like, Mom, I want to go see my dad. I need to see my dad. And so, yeah, we, you know, do the best we can. It's a 3.5-hour drive right now. It used to be 8 hours, but now it's a little closer, so we can do the trip in a day.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to stop now to keep us on schedule. Dr. Kaplow, would you just wrap up, and then I've got one announcement I need to make before I let you take a 15-minute break. Go ahead.
Sure, and actually I'm going to turn it over to Gregory because he was the brilliant mind behind a lot of these concluding thoughts and actions, but so Gregory, you want to take the lead?
And happy to close out with Monique too. Yeah, just the last item on here is what we're doing today, which is moving at a different speed than the urgent systems always require and demand of us. So we all had to slow down over these 2 days to do some undoing and then move. So that's why this last slide is concluding thoughts and actions, because this is, I think, important contemplative time to think through like really complex social problems like this, and then move afterwards. So I just want to highlight the importance of slowing down and not operating at the urgent speed that we normally do during these 2 days, and then also of action afterwards.
Yeah, and the next point is how capable are you in your courts? I don't know if you've ever seen that video of the dancing man, but he stands up dancing on the hill, and then someone joins him, and then everybody joins him. Sir, I think you're the man dancing on the hill. So we just need other folks to come and join him. And that's the point. The second point is, you know, really just take some kind of figuring out, getting creative. How can we fix this?
So we're here afterwards to further the conversation and over the next couple of days too. Thank you so much for all your time.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panel. Incredible presentation. I want to thank the Meadows Foundation for supporting your work and the Meadows Institute. It's a unique institute. Monique, I want to thank you particularly for sharing. I know that had to be incredibly difficult, but thank you so much.